I am Andrew Powell. I'm a learning experience designer here at ALU.
And I'm Mark Dawson.
And we are here to explain to you a bit about our sprint process. And this is something that some of you may have already heard about, but we're going to walk you through the basics of the why, the what, and the how for sprints at ALU. So if you're new to ALU, you may be saying, well, what is a sprint? And a sprint is a way to do project management. It's not the way, but it's a way that's really useful for certain types of projects. We think that any project management process at ALU needs four key things. And those key things are communication, accountability, prioritization, and delegation. It makes a nice acronym if you have trouble remembering it, of CAPT. So with any project management process, you want to make sure that you have these four key things. Now, there's lots of different approaches to project management, and I'll bucket those generally into three different sorts of approaches. One would be a traditional approach. So let's say that we're here at point A, and we know broadly that we're trying to achieve something over here, area B, and we're not sure exactly what it is. So we could craft a traditional work plan where we create clear deliverables, clear deadlines, clear accountability of who's going to do what, and we set this, and maybe the project's going to be 3 months long, and you create that work plan and then you work it. And the problem is you may realize once you get there that actually point B was down here and you missed your goal. So in many cases, particularly in startups, when you don't have clear line of sight of exactly where you need to go, this traditional approach doesn't work super well. Another approach that you could do is, again, we're here at point A and we're trying to go over here to space B, and we're not sure exactly what the final product ought to look like, so we just improvise and we go this way and we kind of loop around and we move in all sorts of different directions and places, and eventually, yes, you get there, but it's very inefficient. And you may have worked on a project like this before where you just sort of improvised at any given time what you felt like was the thing you should do that day. So that's another approach, and again, we call it the improvise approach. And likewise, it's not very effective. So another methodology is this concept called a sprint. And with a sprint, we're again starting over here at A, and we don't know exactly what B looks like, but you go in a series of sprints where for a set amount of time, you have a focused set of priorities, and then you take time occasionally to pivot, adjust your priorities, and then move again. And those sprints eventually enable you to get to your goal with hopefully a lot more efficiency than the improvise approach. And so with that framing of why, I'll hand it over to Mark so that he can walk us through some of the specifics of how we do that at ALU.
Thanks, Andrew. To get started with your sprint process, it's going to help you out if you have a few key things to guide your team along the way. For us, we outline 3 key documents that you'll need and 3 key meeting types. These will be your framework for executing on your sprints. The 3 documents that you'll need are a backlog, a progress tracker, a team handbook. Most teams will develop these sorts of things organically. Your 3 key meeting types will be a planning meeting, a retrospective, where you review your work, and what we're calling here a post-mortem. And I'll explain that in a minute. I'm just going to take a moment to dive in depth about each of these documents and meetings and how they fit together. So a backlog is a list of everything that your team wants to accomplish over the course of the entire project. It's a very inclusive document. It's not a commitment to actually do the things in the backlog, before your project starts, I would recommend having a meeting with all of your team and maybe even just some stakeholders where you list out everything that your team might want to accomplish and put it all in this big backlog. And then once you have that backlog created, and it's okay if it's not finished after that initial creation, you can update it along the way. You're going to use that backlog and go into your planning meeting. At your planning meeting, you're going to pull the items that seem most important or most urgent from the backlog and put it into a progress tracker for your team to begin work on. The planning meeting will mark the beginning of the sprint. It'll usually be on the very first day of the sprint. And once you pick the items from the backlog and put it in your progress tracker, you normally wouldn't want to change priorities in the middle of the sprint, just like Andrew talked about. At the beginning of the sprint, you pick your priorities and what you want to be working on, so that way in the middle of the sprint you don't have to change and confuse your team with new priorities or new tasks to be working on. The most important part of the planning meeting is prioritization. If you get that right, then your team will always be working on the tasks that are most important and most urgent. If you do a poor job of that, then your team might wonder why they're working on certain things at a particular point in time. And so once you put it into the progress tracker, you sprint on that. You execute for the next 2 weeks. You don't change priorities. You don't change ways of working. It's very predictable and consistent. Everyone comes in and knows what they should be working on each day. At the end of the planning, or at the end of the sprint, on the same day that you pick the sprint, that you pick the planning meeting, you should also pick a date on the calendar for your retrospective. At the end of the sprint, you hold your retrospective meeting and you review your progress tracker and you look at where all the items ended up. Your retrospective is your opportunity to do 2 really important things. You review the progress that you've done. You see where each card ended up.
Thanks, Jonathan.
And you improve ways of working. Hey, John.
Got some cash.
You improve ways of working. And what does improving ways of working look like? Well, really specifically, you want to end up updating your team handbook. Your team handbook is your document for the processes of how your team operates. So one thing that you might say during a retrospective is maybe the team had a lot of trouble getting a hold of some remote team members. And so maybe you update your team handbook to say that team members, especially if they're working remotely, should reply to emails within 24 hours. That's an example of a practice that gets surfaced during retrospective and updated in the team handbook as a result. And so here you can see how each of the key pieces fit together to make a really high-performing team. Now, there's one thing I haven't addressed, which is this post-mortem. A post-mortem is like a retrospective in that you're reviewing something that happened in the past and you're trying to improve ways of working. But the key difference is that retrospectives are planned and regular. And post-mortems are a reaction to an unexpected or surprising event, normally where something went wrong. It's important to have a way to talk about things that went wrong ahead of time, because normally in the middle of a crisis, it can be really hard to be rational or know what the best course of action is. So your post-mortem is your team's opportunity to surface whatever caused the bad thing and improve ways of working by updating your team handbook to prevent it from happening in the future. So that's a brief overview of how these 3 key documents and 3 meeting types fit together. And if used effectively, then your team is on track for success.
Absolutely. So, as we said before, these aren't the only way that you can achieve great project management, but through this you can see clear ways that communication, accountability, prioritization, and delegation are embedded in the fabric of how this system works. So that is a brief overview in terms of how we do sprints here at ALU. We hope that your team will be successful in implementing this. Feel free to grab either of us if you see us in the office, or send us a note if you have any questions about how this works and how it could be applied in your team. We've created a starter pack that has sample agendas for each of these 3 key meetings, as well as a template for the key documents that you can then build from and customize for your own team as you use your own sprint process. So I think that covers everything. Anything you want to add, Mark, before we close off?
I would just add that these things seem really simple. Communication, accountability, prioritization, delegation. It seems like, of course, every team would have these types of things,
Right.
but you only have to work on a team that doesn't have some of those things to realize how important they truly are. The agile process is great, as Andrew pointed out in the very beginning, if you're working on a mid to long-term project and you're not exactly sure where you're going to end up. If you're working on something like that, then we recommend trying our approach.
Yeah, and it takes some change from, old habits die hard, and so it'll probably initially feel a little bit awkward. It'll feel unnatural to be using this new sort of process rather than more of an improvised approach or whatever system you've been used to. But speaking from personal experience, it can drive amazing results for you and your team if you stick with it. So best of luck. Really excited that you're taking the first steps towards implementing sprints on your team, and hope that it goes well.
Thanks, guys.